Welcome to this deep dive, you guys, into The Invisible Man 2020. We've gotten some really interesting analysis on this film from you listeners. It seems like you're ready to kind of peel back the layers on this one. So let's dive in and see how this film takes, well, a classic monster movie idea and turns it into something much more, well, insidious and real.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, how the film, like, right away throws us into this world of tension, right? All this
Mm.
unseen, like, danger
Right.
right
Huh.
from the opening escape.
Cecilia getting out of Adrian's mansion. I mean,
Mm.
it's so quiet, but man, it's like one of the most anxiety-inducing scenes I've seen in a while.
Yeah.
Like every little sound, every time she, glances over her shoulder, you just like something bad's about to happen.
Right. You really feel like you're being watched, right? Like something's lurking just out of sight. Even though we don't actually, like, see Adrian at this point, it really sets the tone for the whole film.
Totally.
Yeah.
You get that sense of unease. You see the power dynamic like right away,
Oh.
and then she thinks she's escaped, and boom, the gaslighting starts. Which honestly, I think that's what makes this so disturbing. I mean, do you think that like the filmmakers were purposely kind of blurring the lines, between the literal invisibility and the metaphorical, like with the gaslighting?
I think definitely, yeah. The film uses gaslighting to, like, show how abusers can manipulate their victims,
Ah.
right, in those invisible ways. We see Cecilia going through these weird events and, like, no one believes her. They question if she's, lost it and just totally dismiss what she's saying.
It's got to be terrifying. That isolation, that disbelief.
Absolutely. And I think, that's what makes a film so effective, like unsettling. It really taps into this fear we all have, the fear of not being seen, not being heard, not being believed.
And talking about not being believed, I think that leads perfectly into the restaurant scene. That one really got under my skin.
Oh, for sure. I mean, talk about suspense. That scene is like a textbook example of psychological horror. Like, you think Cecilia's finally safe. She's out in public in a restaurant. But then Adrian, still invisible, attacks her sister.
Totally unexpected. It was like you think, okay, she's in a crowd, she should be safe. But Adrian uses that, right?
Mm.
He uses the setting to his advantage because he knows it'll just isolate Cecilia even more.
Exactly. I mean, it shows how far Adrian is willing to go, right?
Right.
And how he manipulates, like, the whole social situation, almost like he's making those bystanders part of it without them even knowing. Like, he's pulling the strings.
Seriously, I felt like I was holding my breath through that whole scene.
It's definitely one of those edge-of-your-seat moments, but I think it also, beyond just the horror, it shows us so much about Adrian, right? Like, we realize this guy isn't just some stalker, he's a straight-up manipulator,
Yeah.
He's willing to do whatever it takes to control Cecilia. Just, like, pure cruelty.
It's really chilling. The way it's filmed, and it just adds to that sense of dread and paranoia.
Definitely. I mean, the director's use of, like, negative space is masterful. You have all these wide shots, right? Cecilia often right there in the center, but surrounded by, like, emptiness. So as a viewer, you can't help but, like, search the background, look for clues, just like Cecilia is.
There's that one shot, I think it's right after she gets to the safe house. She's standing in a doorway, and the whole room behind her is just dark and empty. You're just waiting for something to happen, but you don't know when or where.
Yes, that one. It's such a great example, right? It creates this feeling like someone's watching you, even when there's no one there.
And the sound, too, right? The silence. It's almost as scary as the attacks themselves.
Absolutely. The film uses silence in such a powerful way. Then suddenly there's like a floorboard creaking or a door slams shut and it makes you jump out of your skin. It really, like, plays with your senses.
Like tapping into that, like, primal fear of the unknown, right?
Yeah. Exactly. We're wired to be afraid of what we can't see. And The Invisible Man just plays on that fear so well, using both visuals and sound to just create this, like, constant dread,
Right.
and anticipation.
And then there's the invisibility suit itself.
Hmm.
It's both a literal weapon and a metaphorical one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Literally, the suit gives Adrian the ability to, stalk Cecilia, terrorize her, and no one can see him. But then, symbolically, I think it represents those unseen ways abusers operate,
Yeah.
The manipulation, the control, things that are often hidden from everyone else. The suit, it's like a metaphor for all those unseen forces.
And it makes you think, right? It's not just about being physically invisible. It's about how so many forms of abuse and oppression, they're invisible in our society.
Exactly. It makes you consider how often victims are silenced, made to feel invisible. And it's not just limited to domestic abuse, right? We see it in all sorts of power dynamics, systemic issues.
Which actually brings us to a really important point in the film. When they discover Adrian's suit,
Oh, yeah, that scene in the lab, it's a moment of realization for Cecilia and for us watching that this threat is even more real and scary than we thought.
It's like all her fears are suddenly validated. But it also raises those questions about, technology and its role in our lives.
You're right. The suit becomes the symbol, of how technology can be used for good and for bad. It makes you think about the ethics of it all, right? How easily something advanced like that could be misused. I think finding that suit, it's a real turning point for Cecilia. Like up to this point, she's mostly reacting to Adrian, right? But now she has proof.
It's like she shifts from, just being a victim to taking control, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Like she's armed with knowledge now. She starts using what she knows about Adrian, about his tech, against him, setting traps, anticipating his moves. She even, like, manages to get a hold of another suit.
Yeah, that scene where she sets up all those cameras in the house, right?
Yeah.
Knowing he's going to be watching her, using that footage to finally expose him. It's brilliant.
So satisfying for the audience, too, right? Because it's like we're so used to seeing the Invisible Man as this all-powerful figure, the one in control. But Cecilia flips it. She uses his own tech to, like, force him into the light, make everyone see what he's doing.
It's a good reminder that knowledge is power, right? And I don't just mean like physical strength or knowing how to use gadgets. It's about understanding the other person, their weaknesses, how they think. She outsmarts him.
Exactly. Cecilia's whole journey from victim to survivor, it speaks to, like, human resilience,
Yeah.
that we can be resourceful. And it really connects with this bigger conversation we're having as a society about abuse, about power dynamics.
Yeah, I see that. Like for so long, victims haven't been heard, their stories were ignored. But Cecilia fighting back, it feels like a symbol, right, of this movement we're seeing where survivors are speaking out and challenging those systems that protected abusers.
Totally. It's like a reminder that even when things seem impossible, you can still resist. You can take back control. A message that I think is really powerful, especially now in the wake of the hashtag Me Too movement.
Makes you think about all the different ways survivors are fighting back now. Social media, the courts, therapy, and even, like in Cecilia's case, using the abuser's own tools against them.
It's about finding ways to, like, level the playing field, making the invisible visible.
And speaking of making the invisible visible, I have to ask about the final showdown between Cecilia and Adrian. Man, that scene is so tense, so ambiguous, it really leaves you thinking, what'd you make of it?
Oh, yeah. The ending. It's definitely one of the things people keep talking about, right? It's almost like a mirrored version of that opening scene where she escapes. But now Cecilia's the one in control.
And the way she uses his suit, his invisibility to, well, to cause his death, it makes you wonder, right? Has she really escaped the cycle of violence? Or has she become like a version of him in a way?
Yeah. It's a tough one, morally complex. There are no easy answers. It forces us to think about, justice, revenge, the scars that trauma leaves behind.
I was back and forth, like, were her actions justified or did she go too far? It really gets under your skin.
See, that's what I love about this film. It doesn't try to give you simple answers. You're left with the ambiguity, just like Cecilia.
The film also, it touches on these bigger anxieties we have as a society, especially about technology, about being watched.
For sure. I mean, Adrian's suit is like this perfect symbol, right, of those unseen forces that can be used to control us, to manipulate us. It plays on those fears we have about surveillance, about data, algorithms knowing our every move.
It does. It's like a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
For how our world is getting more complex, more interconnected. We're surrounded by these invisible systems, tech that we don't really understand, which can be pretty freaky when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why The Invisible Man hits home for so many people, It reflects the anxieties we all feel. Living in a world where so much is happening that we can't see, things we can't control.
Makes you wonder, what's really invisible in our society?
Right. It's like the film's asking us to think about those forces, the ones that shape our lives. Power structures, bias, environmental stuff, things that are often hidden.
Like, just because we can't see something, it doesn't mean it's not real, or that it's not affecting us in a major way. So I guess the question is, what do we do with this awareness?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the film's telling us, hey, be more aware, question what you see and hear. Don't just accept things at face value.
Trust your gut, right? Especially if something feels wrong, even if you can't quite explain it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to speak up for yourself and for others who might be facing those unseen threats.
Maybe, by having these conversations, by shining a light on things, we can start to change things. Create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, believed.
Now that's a powerful message and a hopeful one. But before we wrap up this whole deep dive, let's give our listener something to think about, something to really spark their imagination.
It's funny when you think about it. Invisibility, it's usually something we see in like fantasy stories, right? Or
Yeah.
sci-fi. But the Invisible Man really brings it into like the real world.
It does, yeah. And that's part of what makes it so creepy because if you really stop and think about it, there are so many things like invisible forces in our lives.
Exactly. And I don't mean people turning invisible, right? I mean
Yeah.
the stuff that happens that we don't see behind the scenes like we were talking about before. All those algorithms, the politics, the environment.
Right, right. And those things, they affect us, even if we don't always see them or get them. Like, remember how Cecilia couldn't prove Adrian was even there at first? It's kind of like that. We have a hard time understanding the things that are like secretly shaping our world.
Man, that's kind of scary when you put it that way. There's that scene, I keep thinking about it, where Cecilia's at that job interview and she's trying to explain everything that happened, but the people interviewing her, they just give her this look, like polite, but like they don't believe her. You can tell she just feels like totally invisible, not heard at all.
Oh, yeah, that scene. It's powerful stuff. Because we've all felt that way, right? At some point, like, our voices don't matter. What we've been through doesn't count.
For sure. And it makes you realize, being invisible can mean not having any power. If no one sees you, you're vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Easy to take advantage of. It's like you said before, not being believed. That's a form of abuse in itself.
Totally. And the film, it shows us that so clearly. But the thing is, Cecilia, she eventually finds a way to fight back, to make herself seen again.
Right. She uses her smarts, her resourcefulness. She even uses Adrian's own tech to expose him, to force everyone to see him. It's like, we're not totally helpless against these forces, even the invisible ones.
Exactly. That's a huge takeaway from this movie, I think. We might not always be able to see what's going on behind the scenes, but we can learn to spot the signs,
Mm.
to trust our instincts and to push back when something's trying to control us, to shut us up.
It's like the film is giving us this guidebook, right? For how to live in a world where there's so much we don't see. Be careful, pay attention, question things, and never underestimate what happens when we drag those hidden things out into the open.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Yeah.
So, to everyone listening, as you go about your day, think about this. What invisible forces are you coming up against? What assumptions are you making without even realizing it? Where are you choosing to look, and what are you choosing to ignore?
And what can you do, even if it's something small, to shed some light on those hidden spots, to help those voices that are being silenced get heard, and to make sure that everyone feels seen, heard, and believed? We hope this whole deep dive has given you some new things to think about the invisible man, but also about, those unseen forces in our own lives. Thanks for joining us. Yeah.